Hello everyone, both here and in cyberspace. My name is Rabbi Jacobson, and I will be beginning now a new series which is called Advice series, dealing with human vices. An exciting topic, the human vices. And this week we'll begin with part one, which will be how to deal with anger. And that is that we do not sense our intrinsic oneness and our intrinsic connection. And nature does. Everything in the natural world sees itself as a symbiotic organism where there's a perfect balance. Unless the human intervenes, there's an unbelievable balance to nature. Even things like what we call natural disasters, like hurricanes and earthquakes and tsunamis and cyclones and typhoons and so on, in the natural sense of it, they're actually part of the cycle that keeps the world balanced. And if you know there weren't earthquakes and there were no hurricanes, they're like essentially like the vacuum cleaner and the reality and the market correction, so-called, of a natural universe. It's only when human beings get involved that's when it becomes what we call a natural disaster. So if you think of nature itself, or even the human body, for a cosmic level, each of us look at a healthy human body. Fascinating study in engineering, in biology, in chemistry. And actually all technology really is just trying to copy the fluidity and the harmony that we find in nature and we find in our own physical bodies and so on. So it's the only exception is the human being that we're able to deny our so-called complementary interconnectivity. That is really the hallmark of all of existence. And different ways to explain it, if you go by the theory of free choice and free will, as the humorist said, we must believe in free choice. We must believe in free will. We have no choice. You could wrap your head around that one. However, if you go with that argument, so obviously the human being has the capacity to both refine, elevate the world to another place, or destroy. And we see, unfortunately, the history of war, the history of, as I said, injustice, the history of genocides on all levels. We're not discussing here one or the other, is based on essential misunderstanding, more than a misunderstanding, that would be an understatement, a central distortion of our inability to recognize that we're really all parts of one whole. And as the Talmud puts it, and the mystics explain it, just as it would be inconceivable for the right hand on the human body to hit the left hand, or for any one part of our 75 trillion cells to turn against the other cells, just as that inconceivable that is, the same way it should be inconceivable for us to hurt each other. Because we are essentially, as one beautiful poetic way of putting it, the universe is a large organism and the human being is a small universe. And the only reason we are able to not see that we are able to hurt each other is because we do not see the connection. We don't sense it. So even though it makes sense, but we don't sense it. So then egos get into play. And egos lead to selfishness, and selfishness leads to self-interest. Self-interest, mine is not yours, my interest is not your interest, and hence you have the beginnings and the roots of dissent and divisiveness, and ultimately even destruction. And the same is true on the microcosmic level. You know, God forbid, an autoimmune disease is when one part of the body rejects other parts and doesn't realize that really you're all part of one body, is what happens. It's the self-destructive. So I say that as an introduction because I'd like to speak about this class has been going on now since, I'm embarrassed to say how old I am, it's since 1982. It's a long time ago, right? 1982 was pre-computers, pre-fax, pre-internet, pre-email, not of course. It was the prehistoric age. Basically, we had camels and donkeys, and that's how we delivered the mail, relatively speaking. But I remember it very vividly. I was already an adult. I used to use a typewriter. Have you ever seen a typewriter? They're extinct today. And I remember when we got our first computers in 1983. The first PC came out then. Before the PC was a Commodore. I remember I still have that computer in my office, a little green box. You know, the screen was built in with a keyboard, solid one piece. $5,000 for 5 meg of memory. That's what it was, 5 meg of memory. Like today, what you have less, you have more of that in the calculator. And it was an interesting experience, and it was interesting to see how things evolved and the world in which we live in today. So I can tell you, as a someone coming from the prehistoric age, I'm like a fossil, I could think, right? I guess I'm the oldest guy in the room here. I don't know if I'm the oldest guy on earth, and that's not. But I can tell you from the prehistoric age, with all the technology that is and advancements, we still are seeking to be happy people. Relationships are still in crisis. Intimacy is a challenge. Love is difficult to find. So technology has not changed any of that. As they would say then, I don't know if they still say, junk in, junk out. You know, technology speeds things up. If you put good things into it, it accelerates that. And if you put bad things into it, it accelerates the bad. But getting back to the topic, so this class has been going on, and I've always touched on that theme of the psycho-spiritual universal message to each one of us, based on tradition I grew up in. But as I said, the tradition has two elements to it. There is the element that is so-called Jewish, but there's an element that's very universal, and therefore has great similarities to other mystical systems. And of course, besides the fact that the major religions, the Western religions, actually are derivatives of Jewish thought and the Bible and so on. So the ideas are coming from those sources, but the presentation is far more universal, as you usually will hear, not denominational nor partisan and so on. So in that, getting back to the context of this discussion, which is vices. So the truth is, the approach, the philosophy and psychology that I have always espoused and how I grew up was always a positive one. Instead of focusing on fighting demons, you always focus on building your angels, because it's much healthier and much more empowering, you can even say, when you accentuate the good within you. And the best defense, the best defense is offense. So instead of how many of us dwell, and we don't, it's even most of us are even ashamed to say how many hours of the day were drained by fighting the demons in our psyches. And the demons can be different fears, known fears, unknown fears, real fears, imagined fears, things that we carry from our childhood, trauma or abuse or abandonment, or the whole slew of psychological challenges that we carry. And then, of course, it spills over into our adult life and our relationships. Relationships are challenging. They can be beautiful, but they can also be very demanding and very difficult. And many of us have had our disappointments. We've had our dreams shattered. We've had many of our expectations not realized. We've had betrayals. So you add all that into the equation. I'm not trying to depress anyone. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. It adds up to there is darkness in our lives. So there's two approaches generally. Do you fight the darkness, or do you try to bring in light? And light automatically dispels darkness. And I think it's obvious that we would all choose the latter over the former. Now, it's not so easy, because when a person is consumed with negative thoughts and is consumed with negative thinking, it's not just easy to say, hey, just be positive. It's nice on paper, but emotionally, a person who's accustomed to being hurt or being beat up or feels that they don't deserve, or low self-esteem or other factors, you can become your own worst enemy, and you don't allow that light into your life, which would be the blessing. But at the same time, there are times we do need to focus on a vice. You can't always only just say, I'll bring light into the picture. In the case of what we're discussing this first part, let's talk about anger, rage, wrath. So, people, and of course there's a wide spectrum, so I'm not going to simplify by saying all anger is equal. Obviously not. So on one end of the spectrum, let's talk the worst case scenarios of people who have serious anger issues. Things that tick them off, they get completely, almost out of control. Some yell, some can become physical, some throw things, tantrums, and can offend many people, even though they may not want to. But people some have very pent up and deep anger. Sometimes that anger doesn't emerge immediately, like a volcano. It may take years, it may take cumulative experiences for it to erupt and really have a strong impact. There are people who carry that anger is simmering but beneath the surface, and then something happens and you suddenly can't believe how angry that person is. So there's that one extreme, anger, deep anger. Some expressed, some not expressed. Then there's, of course, along the spectrum, you go along the spectrum, less blatant forms of it, but there could be a certain angry streak, a certain feeling of being, a feeling of resentment to people or to experiences, or just spilling over to things in life. You see other people who are successful, and it borders on some almost form of envy which is really not what we're discussing, but it has a spillover, anger and envy sometimes. So there's that version. And then as you go along the spectrum, we'll go to the lightest version, is the anger that most of us experience, even if it's not chronic or any way intense. From time to time, something ticks you off, something happens at the office, at home, that you just burst out in anger. And you're not always happy, you regret it at times, even if it's had legitimate reasons. Often anger brings to more problems than it solves. Because even if you were legitimately, someone did something to you that deserved a strong response, but anger may not be the best way to resolve it, because anger just elicits even more negative energy. So however we define anger, I'll try to address all forms of it, but obviously can't cover every scenario. Because there's 7 billion people on this planet, I am sure that 7 billion people have different ways that they express and how they feel their anger. So it's really the real challenge is, as I discussed last week about procrastination, is getting to the root of it, the root of the issue. Because like in medicine, you have symptomatic medicine, which means dealing with symptoms like Band-Aids, Advil, painkillers that relieve the immediate issue, short-term solution, which in some instances may be enough. Because if it's not a deeper problem, why not? Why need to dig further? But as we all know, problems that are really deeper, a short-term Band-Aid is not going to really resolve it. It may stop the bleeding, and you may buy some time, which could be helpful, but you may need deeper, just like it is in physical medicine, that you may need more intervention or more invasive intervention. The same thing as psychologically. There are issues that are more deeper rooted that cannot just be resolved with a sugar coating or a Band-Aid or some short-term solution. So of course then the question begs the question, what is the root of anger? What is its root? You look around, and this is helpful, of course. I always bring this up because you always want to put things into context and contrast. So in a study of contrast, you don't find, for example, children that are born angry. There's no such thing as an angry child, born angry. You have, I will qualify that, you have instances of a certain angriness in a child, but that's usually a result of either a mother that was abusive in pregnancy and it upset the chemical balance of the child, so that's possible, or some very serious trauma. So it won't be angry. A child obviously is not going to just become angry at people, but there may be something that the child carries that can have that. But that's really exceptions and always an aberration. No one will say that it's a genetic thing. Some people are just born angry and some people are not. We'll talk about predispositions and personalities and so-called temperaments in a moment. But I'm talking about pure to say that some people are just wired to be angry. I don't think there are any studies that show anything like that, and I don't think they could show that, because why would a child be... Anger, as we shall soon discuss, is not something that is necessarily natural to us. Anger is a response to something that's not natural. Now, obviously we all know there's the debate of nurture versus nature, which means, which many people understand today as being that sometimes you can't even tell the difference. If something happened to you earlier in early part of your life, even if it was not nature, it was nurture, meaning it came as a not a natural and innate element in your personality, but something that came later. But sometimes if it's early on, it can be almost indistinguishable from nature. It can become what you call a second nature. So for instance, if a child grows up in an angry home, and I'm just using the worst case scenario, both parents are angry, and the child is exposed to anger from day one, yelling, screaming, just that whole negative energy that anger brings. It doesn't always have to express itself. Obviously, that child's going to be impacted by that. So if that happens at an early age, so if you see that child in 10 years down the road, or 20 years, you may not know the difference. You may say that child was born angry, but not necessarily. They may have grown up in an angry environment. And let me explain, when angry environment doesn't always mean yelling and screaming. Angry could be passive-aggressive. It could be silent treatment. It could be just a resentment that's not spoken. Unfortunately, we all are familiar with the two different ways people react when they get upset. Some people get angry and they get aggressive, and some people get very distant and silence. Which is worse, the silent treatment or the aggressive? Silent treatment can be worse. I don't know if anybody's married here, but if your wife gives you silent treatment, it's not a very pleasant experience. I'm not going to ask you if you've ever experienced it, but anyone that has knows it's not pleasant. So anger doesn't always mean loud and and obvious, and it could also be very silent. It's just angry energy, a lot of angry energy. You ever go to a party, a wedding, an event, and you just feel it. You can feel in the vibes. And it usually begins with the hosts. If the hosts are upset about something or they have a lot of anger, it spills down. It spills down to the staff and it spills to the guests, and you just feel, it's not like you don't feel the comfort. You go to another place, you feel a certain ease, a pleasantness, a lightness. And this is something we all experience. You don't have to necessarily be the most sensitive person. You can pick up the vibes, angry vibes. You could pick up more gentle vibes. So anger is, of course, much more than, as I said, just the way we express things. It's a sense of what energy you give off. So children are not born angry. That gives us a certain hint that helps us diagnose that it's not the natural state of a healthy human being. Anger would be, therefore, an aberration. It would be somewhat of an anomaly that even despite the fact that some people are angry all the time, that's still not the natural state of a human being. And if you think about it, I go back to what I opened up with about nature. Is there anything in nature that's angry? I'm not talking about the mineral and vegetable world. Let's talk about the animal world. So some will say, yeah, we know there are angry animals. If they're hungry, if they are protecting their young, they can become very angry. But are they really angry, or are they just reacting naturally to a natural circumstance, either hunger or threat? So of course you'll see them become more protective, more defensive, more aggressive. But is there such a thing as an angry animal? I remember driving up once to the mountains. I'm a New York boy. I grew up here. You don't see many animals in this city. Yeah, we have our squirrels and our pigeons and some of the rodents, cats. What else do we have? Dogs. And I don't know, not much more, do we? Right? I'm not going to get into the cockroaches department. But it's not really a natural habitat. Let's put it that way. That's why people love to go to safaris. They suddenly see real wilderness. So I remember driving up once upstate, and I saw cows grazing in the meadows. Now, I've seen a cow more than once, but it's not. You don't see cows walking. It's not Calcutta, and you don't see cows walking in the streets here. We've gotten rid of anything that's natural. We give a little room for some trees among the concrete. We cut out a Central Park or a Prospect Park, and then we cut out these little places where we put a tree here, a sapling. We are almost like giving permission for nature to be part of our lives. But essentially it's concrete, metal, bricks, the manufactured world, which is very nice, architecture, but it's not natural. So I'm driving up, and I remember watching these the cows. I decided to stop. I was just very interesting. I wanted to do a study of, this was by no means a scientific study. It was just observing. And I was looking, and I was saying, these cows, they're so peaceful. They just walk or just stand in one place and graze in the grass, and there's no neurosis, and there's no restlessness, and they're not bored, and they're not looking to change the channels, and they don't have cell phones, and they don't have texting. They're very calm and relaxed. Some people call it animal bliss. And some humans actually aspire. I wish I had a little animal bliss. The contrast, and I was saying to myself, so what's the difference between them and us? What don't they have? Or what do we have that makes us so... we'd never... Do you know anybody that can just graze in the grass hour after hour, day after day, protecting the young, breeding, being born, dying, doing what they got to do? So they have no stress and need no therapy. It's quite... if you're in a stressful state or an anxious state, it's a pretty envious situation to be in a place like that. Obviously, as I said, most human beings couldn't handle that. And I thought about it, and I said, the things that one of the great rabbis or great mystics writes, a very interesting statement. He says, animals have never seen heaven. What does that mean? Of course, an animal can look up to heaven technically, but animals walk on all fours. And I know some will tell you, what about giraffes and what about the apes? Yeah, but generally speaking, animals walk on all fours. Physiological, they're structured to look down. Which makes sense. Why? Because that's where their sustenance is, either the grass, or the creatures, or whatever it is that they consume, and they're young, so they look down. So they don't have the concept of looking up to the stars as we do. And actually, a beautiful verse by one of the prophets. He says, "Suma, raise your eyes to heaven and see who created it all." We humans have that element of curiosity. We look up to the heavens, we see the stars. We see these planets. We see the mystery of something out there. We want to know what's out there. Just on a very basic level, we want to know, is there life on other planets? And look what we've done. We've spent billions, if not trillions of dollars just to satisfy that curiosity. All the byproducts and the derivatives that were discovered through NASA, they needed to find that way, Velcro. Many of the technologies we have today were all a result of NASA's developing, whether uniforms or food items or other ways to survive in outer space where there's no gravity and so on. But that was not the intention. It wasn't a business. It was simply satisfying human curiosity. And we still pursue it. I just, driving here, heard that they discovered 7 moons around some constellation. I didn't really hear the details. Just literally today. And it fascinates us. And no animal cares. And not that I talked to any animals recently, but I don't think they care. And that's why the same habitats that they lived 500 years ago, 1,000 years. We're constantly looking to improve our lives. We want a better home, a better cell phone, a better television, a better this, a better that, a better car. Because we have a certain element to us that nature does not have, and that is the aspiration for something more. Now, whether you want to call it the soul, I call it the soul, but if you don't like the word soul, it's too religious for you, don't use the word soul. In my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, I use the example of a wick and a flame. You observe a flame and a wick, and a flame is compared to the soul. The flame is the only physical object in nature that defies gravity. I mean, there are gases that defy gravity, helium and so on, but you need to put them in a balloon. But the physical eye, look at a flame, defies gravity. And if you think of it, the flame and the wick is like a container that grounds the flame. If the wick didn't exist, the flame would expire. So the prophet puts it this way, one of the biblical verses, it says, the soul of a human being is the flame of God. And if you look at a flame, it's the closest approximation to our souls. And what is our soul? The same idea. You look up and you want more, and you're restless. The animal grazing in the field is not restless. It doesn't do anything to destroy the world, but it doesn't do anything necessary to improve anything. It's there like the clockwork of nature, necessary, important, and indispensable. But it's not there to change the script. It follows its script. And hence there is no neurosis, and hence there is no restlessness or anxiety. So you can think of it this way, anxiety, and I'm going to be talking about anger obviously, is on one hand, it's true, it's not a natural state, as I mentioned, children are not born angry, but on the other hand, only humans, it's completely unique to humans. Now I just should qualify this as a humorous story, but it happens to be true. The couple that come here from time to this class, they're well-to-do, they live in the city, they own a few dogs, no children, they own a few pets. And they told me one day, they said to me, I thought it was a joke, but then they were very serious. I laughed, and I guess they were offended. They said to me that they took their dog to the veterinarian today, earlier that day, and not just a veterinarian, a dog psychologist. I didn't know there was that. There's not just physical checkup, but a psychological checkup. So we have that too. And the doctor told them that the dog is exhibiting signs of stress and anxiety. And based on his understanding, is because that they too are fighting too much. So the dog is sensing their tension, and it's causing the dog to be anxious. So I began to laugh. I thought it was a joke. But then I realized, they said to me, why are you laughing? It's a serious matter. And I'm still laughing. I'm not laughing at them. I found, I didn't hear about them. It's a new thing, it's news to me. But it's interesting. So animals can also be impacted by us. And that doesn't surprise me, but not natural. So I said to them, ask the doctor, was there a dog that's just anxious without adults, or without rather humans around? So they did, and the doctor said, of course not. Anyway, that's just a footnote. So to get back to our discussion here, what I'm leading to is saying that even though on one hand, yes, anger is not our natural state, but on the other hand, anger, just like anxiety, could also be an outgrowth of something that is positive within us. And that's a fundamental principle, especially in the Jewish mystical ideas and psychological ideas, that there's no such thing as a vice, as a negative, without a positive. So if there's something that's negative, there's always a positive side to it. So there is even a positive side to anger, which of course I will discuss here as well, just laying the groundwork. So in other words, because let's put it the way the mystics would put it, it would be as follows, that every energy in life whether it's a positive energy or negative energy, is energy. It depends how you use it. If you harness it, then it's positive. If you let it destroy you, it's negative. Take fire. And I'm using fire very intentionally, as you'll see in a moment. Fire. Is fire a good thing or a bad thing? A very childish question. If we all know, the answer is depends how you use it. If fire, right, made famous by one rock band, fire, wind, or air, water, and earth. Earth, wind, and fire. And in this case, there's also water. So but there's another name for the four, which is eluding me right now. It is, if you were online, you could look up on Google and tell us what it is. It's four personalities, four dispositions. And one of them relates to fire. I'll get the words for it. Let's see, maybe somebody's sending us a little message here. Anything? Come on, guys, look it up. This is a Facebook feed. So I could ask, and people type to me, and hey, modern technology, I love it. Come on, you're making me angry. I'm just kidding. That's not patience. So, but the bottom line is that fire relates to anger, and we'll talk about that, of course, as the root. But just like fire has a positive side to it, so does anger, because it's energy. When you get angry at something, at least you're not apathetic. Think of it that way. Imagine you were numb and completely indifferent. Then you wouldn't get angry, and things would pass. So anger per se is a negative thing, but the energy that lies behind it may not be so negative, because something upsets you. Now, I'm not suggesting everything that upsets you is legitimate, but it could very well be. When you get angry and you hear, God forbid, you hear about how innocent people were killed completely mercilessly, unjustly, and your blood boils, that's not an unhealthy reaction. The question is what you do with that anger. Whether you use that anger in a destructive way, of vengeance, or do things that justify two wrongs don't make a right. But if you channel that anger into something healthy and positive, it's a tremendous form of energy. It's like fire being channeled and harnessed for good use, which is one of the key things in understanding that it's not about necessarily just subduing your anger or taming it, but rather also harnessing it and getting to the bottom of it. So we'll talk about that some more as well. I'm just laying it out first. So what is then the root of anger? As I said, it's not natural to us, because just as a child is born in pleasant disposition, does not have any reason to get angry. If a child is crying or for food or for sustenance or for in pain or needs something, that's not angry. It sounds, I know a cry can be very annoying and it sounds like anger, but it's not anger. It's a child letting us know, because it can't speak yet. So it was blessed with a gift to let us know. So it's an annoying sound, because if it wasn't annoying, we would just stay sleeping, parents, and we wouldn't pay attention to it. So that's that. Now, you'll say, what about, look, I look at my grandchildren, I see sometimes they get angry. Give me that toy. And the other child yells back, no, and they start kicking and screaming and fighting with each other. I would not put that into the category of anger, because first of all, if you look at children, you'll see that that their anger lasts as much as a melting snow in the heat. It lasts 30 seconds. You see children will say, I'm never going to talk to you again. And 30 seconds later, they're best friends. So it's more, you can say it's childish tantrums or childish things. I wouldn't associate that with a word called anger. Anger is something that is a little more simmering, a little more lasts. If you got angry and just burst out for a second and then you're back to normal with another person, obviously you should apologize and find a way to, not, because anger has a very ugly side to it. But that's not, I wouldn't call it anger. If it's not carried, you don't have anything that's carrying over, it's not spilling over. So maybe not the way to react. And that's why we teach our children, don't react with anger, say please, calm down, share, you find the ways. But that's not really, I wouldn't put that into the spectrum of what we're discussing here regarding that anger. So if children are naturally happy people, happy human beings, so where is the first time that we've ever experienced anger? It's like I've often asked the question, when's the first time you lied? You were duplicitous. You said a flat lie, a flat, what do they call it? A bald-faced lie? What do they call it? Something like it. When's the first time you really got angry? I guarantee you will never remember. Because once you cross that threshold, it's not like you remember the world before that. That's why it's very hard to remember. I'm trying to think, when was the first time I got angry? Anybody can tell? Can you remember when the first time? I don't think we can remember. And it's not because we were too young, it's because it was a different reality. So I would submit that it was probably due to something that you learned from your environment. It could have been a teacher, it could have been a parent, another adult. I remember I'm just, this is completely, just thinking back now, my early years in school. So yeah, I remember teachers, one teacher, second grade teacher was such a gentle soul. I mean, we made him crazy anyway, how kids can be, but he was a really kind person. And I remember the kindness. He was just a kind person. He exuded a kindness. You felt, he was a nice person. And then I remember another teacher, I'm not mentioning names, some of them are not even here on earth anymore, that was just an angry man. And you saw it. It wasn't just that there was rage, it was like always this negative energy and always critical and always like, cynical and biting and like saying, what, you're going to have another apple? That type of person who doesn't, what do they call fagin? That they can't stand when another person is happy for no reason. So we had people like that. And I think that's where we learn. We learn from these adults around us. Hypothetically, if you're around very kind, giving, calm people, you'll develop a calm. My father, extremely calm person. He's already passed away, almost 12 years. But he had this inner calm. I remember from the youngest of age, he would sit, he made you calm. Because nothing could shake him. He could sit for hours, people arguing, this, that, and he didn't have an easy life. He lost his parents at a young age. He was an orphan at 20 and had 2 younger brothers he had to take care of. He came from the former Soviet Union, Russia, Stalin. It wasn't like an easy life. It wasn't like a pleasant life. But he had that inner calm. That is like, it's a gift. And I guess a personality thing, and I assume he picked it up from his parents, who also didn't have an easy life. So I'm just mentioning because I'm giving an example of my own life. Very calm, very calm. My mother, may she be well in many years, does not have that calm. She has much more nervous energy, much more what's called kinetic energy. That's a positive way of saying, I guess, nervous energy. And that's who she is. I mean, she's great. I love her and all that. It's just a contrast. So calm people make us, especially in our formative years. And frankly, even in our calm years, I said before, you go to a party and it's a nice vibe, it makes you feel good. Let's be honest. You go into a party, it's not a good, nice vibe. You may be able to tolerate it and you'll be resilient enough and so-called know how to handle it, but it doesn't make you feel good. And I'm sure we all have these situations. You meet some people who just exude this positive energy. They're cheerful, they make you feel good. And then there are people you meet that you feel a lot of negative energy. Not necessarily even to you. They're just filled with anger, resentment, bitterness, and so on. It'd be interesting to know what people think of you. Which one are you? Like when they meet you, do they feel empowered and uplifted, or do they feel drained? I don't mean to suggest that possibility, but there are people that do that. And it's good to know about yourself. Just like it's hard to recognize our own voice on tape. You ever hear yourself on a recording? It doesn't sound like you. You may also not know what you project. So the point I'm making here is that the children, the anger, comes through life experiences. And of course, if you see your father or your mother, and I'm just using, again, simple examples just to make it digestible and easy to discuss. Obviously it gets far more complicated as we grow into adults. But let's talk simply. If you see your father or mother, one of their coping mechanisms is anger, that's going to definitely become one of your coping mechanisms. Because that's what you learn. You learn from those that were before you. You see your father doesn't get what he wants. Your mother doesn't get what she wants. And they yell. Or they get very upset. Like, where's my chicken? Why are you always late? Where are the keys? Who put this away? And you see that type of anger reacting, whether it's small things or big things. Remember, children don't make distinctions like that. They don't say, oh, this deserves anger and this doesn't. Children are very simple. They see coping mechanisms in a very basic way. And from the earliest of age, so obviously, more or less, you can rest assured that if you saw an adult or parent, especially a parent, whose coping mechanism was one of anger, and for that matter, other coping mechanisms as well, you can rest assured this child is going to adapt that coping mechanism, unless they work on it and stop it, or at some point realize it's not a good way to cope. I know people, and I'm sure you may as well, who anger for them, they don't even realize it's a problem. They say, what do you mean? Everyone gets angry when they're upset. And when I say not everyone gets angry, they say my father, and they don't realize it became so much part of their nature. They think it's just like everybody smiles when they're happy. Everybody gets angry when they're upset. And I said it's not true. People can be upset, but that doesn't mean they have to get angry. This doesn't mean that those that don't get angry don't have any feelings. It all depends how you cope. So anger, first and foremost, is a coping mechanism, a distorted coping mechanism, albeit, but a coping mechanism that people use or think that may be the way to go. Or they don't think. This is what they saw. And most likely, those parents that exhibit that anger probably saw it in their families. So then, of course, you could trace the steps, we could blame everything on Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But not necessarily, because we definitely see people not necessarily got it from their parents. That's my qualification. Sometimes life experiences, life events. I remember my childhood as well. So I had a relative who began biting her nails at a certain age. And that came not from her parents. It came from a friend in school who she admired. That friend was a very, very tense and had a lot of challenges in life. And it became like a way, you copy what your friends do. So I'm not going to suggest that anger is strictly parental attitudes, but it's one of the first usual suspects. Let's put it that way. It's on the first top of the list. But the point here is not so much where we got it from. The point I really want to make is that it is not our natural state. It's something that was taught to us. And taught, obviously, in a way that was not intentional. Because I don't believe that any parent, any healthy parent, would want their children to learn an unhealthy coping mechanism. It's taught inadvertently, by osmosis. It's what you see. And if you're exposed to more of this, meaning through educators or other or friends, or parents of friends, and so on, it impacts you. Essentially, what we're talking about is anger being an energy that's being used by a person in a distorted way, reacting to something that's bothering them. Now, as I mentioned before, there are many ways to learn how to react to something that bothers you. And I want to use an example here. I'm going to use a collective example. In history, you see something very interesting. This is more of not a personal example and a collective one. You find one of the rules, if you study your history, you'll find that most nations, and I'd say probably not only most, probably all, when they were oppressed by a neighbor, whether it was the Greeks or the Romans or the Spanish, whoever it was, and then the nation that was oppressed comes to power, what is the first thing they usually do in history? Vengeance. They exact vengeance on those that oppress them. And this became the rule of history, that there's vengeance. We live in a different type of world today. It still exists, but this was a big part of our history. But you do find exceptions. You do find exceptions of nations that did not go and exact vengeance on another nation, but rather went to build their own lives, and their vengeance was building their families and continue to perpetuate and model a life of virtue. Now, some call it, for example, they talk about Gandhi. The Gandhi's approach in India, which is the Gandhi-like approach, turning your cheek, would never, you don't fight violence with violence. And as much as you may be oppressed, you cannot, whether it's based on Hindu beliefs, Buddhist beliefs, regardless, but there is that attitude. Some people see that as extreme. It may be admirable, and he may have gotten his way in certain areas, but many people have not obviously embraced that, because if there wouldn't be war. But that was his attitude, his approach. Others take another approach, which is the other extreme. Someone attacks you, full out attack and vengeance. And then there's the third approach, where I'm not looking to fight with you, but if you come to attack me, I'm not going to just turn my other cheek. I'm not just going to protest peacefully. I'm going to go to war with you, but as a last resort. Which I think in most instances, especially in the Western world, is probably the what's called the ethical choice, that war is not something anybody wants, but if there's no choice, the Axis, the Nazis, the Japanese attack you at Pearl Harbor, and the Nazis exhibit aggression and make it very clear that they want to conquer everything in their path. So we're not going to just peacefully demonstrate, because it won't help. You go to war at last resort. We're not talking about warriors. We're talking about a peaceful entity that goes to war because there's no choice. Now, you can argue, and this is what I am suggesting on a personal level, the same thing. Someone offends you, you can take the approach, we'll take the most extreme approach. You offend me, I'll offend you. Violence is met with violence. You know? There's the approach where I will go the other extreme. No, I will never respond with any type of violence to you. Like I mentioned with Gandhi. Or the third approach is, listen, as long as I am not going to fight with you with violence, but if you continue to attack me, I will do whatever it takes to defend myself. And if it takes having to, if it's your life or my life, it's going to be your life. Which is, as I said, most of the world has accepted this approach. The Gandhi-like approach is maybe seen as admirable and noble, but very few have embraced it, at least to my knowledge. Maybe I stand corrected. I could be that there are religious or spiritual monks or others who live a monastic lifestyle, maybe have that attitude. I'm sure the Dalai Lama and that part of the world, well, they were exiled from Tibet, but I assume that's the attitude they take. But I don't know to the extent that I haven't really done my research. It's not really relevant to our discussion. I'm just using it as an example. So in our situation, when someone does something to you, and I'm not talking about violent now, I just use violence as an example. If I'm talking about now something that someone exhibits something that really offends you. They insult you in public. They do something really upsetting. So what will be your reaction? If you've seen in your childhood and in your life that the natural reaction that the coping mechanism reaction is one of anger, that's what most of us will do. We'll show anger. We will yell at that person. We may insult them in return. Or the other approach, which is the silent. It's also a form of anger. We will shut down, passive aggressive, which we've also seen, something we pick up. That when something we don't like, we retreat, but we retreat with, it's loud, but it's silent. The attitude to be able to think it through and say, 1 second, here's a person who said something to me. I really feel that they did something wrong, but I am not out of control. I'm not out of control that I suddenly have emotional knee-jerk reaction one way or other, that I get either extremely angry or that I get extremely silent. I'm not going to be silenced. I'm not going to be provoked. I will make a deliberate decision how I want to react. This, of course, is of course the healthy approach. Because what you're doing is deliberating on the issue. You're going to think it over, you'll sleep on it, and you'll make a decision. If indeed this is something that deserves a reaction, nothing lost. You waited overnight, and you decided that I'm going to do it not in the throes of your emotional feelings, which often is the time we make mistakes. You think about it, and maybe the next day you go over to that person, and you may say something strong, or you may write something, or you may choose to move on. It's not my problem. That, of course, is the healthy approach. Now, we all know on paper it sounds like, why can't we just do that? Because I go back, because the problem is, once you've developed a coping mechanism, it's knee-jerk. You don't think about it. You just react. You don't have the so-called composure and presence of mind to just say, let me reflect on it. Let me deliberate. Obviously, if you did that, we wouldn't make most of the mistakes we do. Think of any of the vices. Of almost any vice we have, and I'd say everyone, is all a result usually of impulsive behavior. It's impulsive. Something tempts you. So feeling sensation is actually a good thing. When it comes to psychological anger, that's not a natural reflex. That's an assumed reflex that does not have to be that way. So if you are convinced that this is not who you are, and you're able to distinguish between you and your anger, you're already halfway there, because you're no longer a product of it. Now, I'm not suggesting it's an easy thing to come to, because if for the last 20 years of your life, or 10 years of your life, or 5, this is the way you've coped, it's not like suddenly you say, oh, you know what? I'm dropping this coping mechanism, let me find another one. So the first step in diffusing anger is realizing it's a assumed, superimposed coping mechanism that is not natural to you. Yet there is also a positive side to it, because it means you are not apathetic, you're feeling, you're sensitive, and therefore you're reacting. So the reaction is fine. The reaction in anger is not fine. So the way to really think about it is, can I Do I have the state of mind, the presence of mind, to have that self? I suggest don't start big. Don't look at the big things that make you angry. Start small. Next time someone says something offensive that you would usually react strongly to, you say to yourself, you know what? Let me think about this. Let me watch myself. Even watch yourself. Watch yourself getting angry and saying, fine, the fire has gone up. Let me go for a walk. Let me sleep on it. Let me get out of the line of fire. And then step back and say, okay, what should I do now? Maybe consult someone. This and this happened. You know, people often call me and they say this happened. You know, it's either someone did something really wrong. It can cause damage. It can, sometimes it's something not so serious. It's obviously case by case. But the mere fact that you're doing it, you regain control. And so in a sense, that's what we really want to do. So I'll talk in a moment about the roots of anger in a deeper cosmic sense. But I wanted to first speak about it in that sense. So the root of anger is a misplaced form of expressing your indignation or upsetness about something. So the expression of feeling upset is not the issue in most cases. I should qualify that. I'll do that in a moment. But it's the expression of how you should do it. You know, just because something you feel upset about, who says that's the way to express it? And as intelligent people, we should always be looking for expanding our horizons and broadening our tool chest, so to speak, an arsenal, and how we cope. Why should we only have 3 coping mechanisms? Maybe we should have 50 at our disposal. You have more alternatives, you have more options, which makes you far more in control in your life. The qualification I wanted to mention was this, that I was saying that that anger at its root is only, it's a misplaced, it's called a wrong, you're using the wrong tool. It's like trying to use a hammer to pull out a thread from your jacket or something. You know, I don't know if that's a good analogy. A hammer to, what would you say? A hammer to get through to somebody, knock a hammer on their head. Meaning you're using the wrong tool for the situation you're in. But, as I said, it could very well be justified that you should be upset or something's wrong, and the anger is a voice, the wrong type of voice, but it's telling you something's wrong. The qualification I want to say is this: there are things that shouldn't even make us angry. That I did not mention. I want to just dwell on that for a moment.
You're using the wrong tool to what?
To resolve either an upset situation or a challenge or something wrong. As I said, you're using a hammer, let's say, to get through to a friend. So you don't knock a hammer on his head. You speak to him, just to use. I mean, I'm sure there's better examples than that. I'm trying to find a good one. You know, we'll get to it. There is an expression. Don't use a hammer to, when you need gentleness. Okay. So here's the example. Imagine a little child comes into this room right now and goes over to you and starts scratching and kicking you and biting you. What are you going to do? In most cases, you'll just brush away the child, and that's that. You're not going to get down on your arms and legs and start kicking and scratching back. Am I correct? I would hope not. Why? It's a baby. A baby, a baby. You're not even going to take it seriously. You don't feel offended. I mean, you may say, where's his parent? But let's say it's your own nephew or niece or something. A baby's a baby. Little children will do that with each other. Now, as an adult, if someone comes to you and says something to you that is offensive, insults you, or the equivalent, does punch you in the face, you're not going to take it the same way, because you're going to say, this is not a baby. This is an adult and equal to me, and I don't want to be mistreated like that. But you'll find that some people get offended by things that other people don't get offended by. Not because the one that's not offended is less sensitive and is oblivious or cold-hearted or has thicker skin. Because when you maturity means that things that offended you when you were younger will not offend you now, because you just have what's called, by the Kabbalists call it, a expansive mind. As your mind expands, emotions are far more controlled. So a child emotionally reacts. Let's say a 5-year-old takes something away from a 5-year-old, they'll react emotionally. A 15-year-old, you can expect and say, no, you don't react that way. You ask, you can request, there's a certain decor and certain etiquette that we develop as adults. Why? We expect more from an adult person than from a child. So there are things that shouldn't bother us. The problem is many of us have never really grown up emotionally. We may be 30 years old, but we may still be 5-year-old when it comes to our emotions. So when someone does something to you, you're going to react. You may not kick and scream. And you're not going to start yelling in a tantrum in the middle of the street, but internally, you may be reacting just like a 5-year-old. That's my qualification. So we have to also recognize that not everything that makes us angry really deserves to be angry at. It could very well be that you're just still in a playground and your little toys were upset. Your comfort zone was shaken up. I mean, you see that all the time. You ever think of and analyze road rage? You all know what road rage is, right? You drive in a car, somebody cuts, and then the next, whatever, as long as that car is there, you're like obsessed. Here's a guy told me actually, he was riding on the highway. Your ideals and your values are of a higher state, higher standards. Other small things don't matter that much. Like for example, just use this example, like a person who's very much loves literature, and that's their thing, and they love to read. A person on that level is going to be far less affected if someone comes and takes away your little toy, because you're not involved in toys. You're not playing with toys anymore. You're now involved in literature. Just using an example, and other examples the same way. I mean, one of the saddest things is how money impacts us. Look at money. Money is something that we all know is impermanent, and nobody can take their money with them after this life. No one has yet mastered that. No one has figured out, and yet people have committed suicide due to financial bankruptcy. People have gotten into wars with brothers and sisters and family members over money. I've never been tested this way, so I can't say what I would do. But it's hard for me to see. I look at, I counsel people. I see brothers that not talk for 20 years because of a financial thing. Not only financial, but money seems to represent something that's more than just money. It represents, I guess, our control, our influence, our ingenuity, our time, our sense of self. So I don't want to go over discuss money right now because it's not really the topic, but it's just an example how we could be very petty and it could really bring us down and stoop to behavior that if you step back 20, 30 years from now, you look back and you say, over that I fought with somebody. Something so ridiculous. But our pride is affected, and like the joke they tell about these two guys in the old age home who were friends for most of their lives, best friends, partners. Now they're both retired, they're both not completely even lucid, but they don't talk to each other anymore. They don't even remember why. And when their children come and say, you were friends for 60 years, you're not going to live forever. You're together in this home. Might as well. And one of them says, no, because if I talk to him, he'll think he was right. And his son asks him, well, what did he do wrong? I don't remember. This is an example. That's how human beings can be. It's back to the absurdity or bizarre behavior that we humans sometimes show. But I wanted to just talk about, so therefore not everything that makes you angry really should make you angry. And that's something you need to review. And if you're an honest person with integrity, you'll talk to someone and objectively say to you, what do you think about this situation? And hopefully you can be open to hearing that not everything that makes you crazy should make you crazy. But let's go back to legitimate grievances, ones that really are. So there, I was saying that even there, anger is not necessarily the right tool. The energy is correct, but it's being used in the wrong way. So to go back to the fire archetype, that's why fire, and we'll be talking next week about vanity. Because interestingly, vanity and arrogance is connected also to fire and also to anger. Because if one doesn't have vanity, they don't have anger. But we'll talk about that next week. So anger and fire have a connection in the sense that fire is the archetype. Fire is passionate, it's aggressive, it's strong, which is of course all the hallmarks of anger. And just like I mentioned before, fire can be used and is necessary for life. It's also misused, can be destructive to life. So let's talk about that a bit more. So what exactly is fire? Fire, besides it being warmth, it's illuminates, and it's warming and illuminating. That's what fire does. Too much fire is destructive. Too little fire, and then you don't have life will be compromised. So when it comes to, in that sense of it, when you find people who, for example, and you see this today on videos, very sad, the indifferent people to, there was this video, a viral video, did you see it? I think it was in China, where a car runs over a child, maybe 10 times, and everybody ignores it. It's one of those examples of the mass, what do they call it? There's a term for it. Like crowd indifference or something. I forgot what it's called. That people, let's say, God forbid, and unfortunately we've seen it even here in New York and other places, someone can get mugged, there are people watching and they'll just walk by. Now, you could say they're afraid for themselves, or they become so indifferent. It's sad to see, it's horrible to see actually, to be indifferent to a crime. So maybe you can't intervene, but do something, don't just walk by as if nothing happened. You could see, have you seen these videos? They have them online, they're not pleasant to look at. But it's like a study in how humans can just completely ignore. Now, usually there will ultimately be one person who will do something. But it's not necessarily that common. So to say that someone does not get upset, and let's take even anger. I don't get angry at an injustice. I would not say that's a mature person. I would say that's a person who may be numb and indifferent, and that's not necessarily a healthy thing. On the other hand, to get angry in a way that anger translates into destructive behavior, as I've been discussing, is also not the option. So there you have the perfect example of something that deserves waking us up and deserves our indignance and our wrath, but you have to know how to translate that wrath and anger. So one of the things I often suggest to people who have a lot of anger in them is, obviously, as I said before, we have to start small. You can't bite off more than you can chew. Is to find a situation they're angry. Like some people are very angry at their parents or parent for a certain thing. And it may be completely legitimate. And this is not about forgiving your parent and saying, no, what they did was fine. Let's talk a real serious form of abuse or not protecting you or something else. And what you've developed is a tremendous anger to that parent, where either you can't talk to them, or every time you do, you yell, or whatever other form of shape it takes. Okay. So how do you deal with that? You don't want to delegitimize the reasons that this person is upset, this child. I'm talking about an adult child now, because there are legitimate reasons. You also don't want to justify the parents and say, no, they're your parents and you have to honor them no matter what, etc. So what you really want to help a person is, your anger is also hurting you. It's not just directed against them. You think that it's a tool that's like you're getting even by showing that you're angry. Let's even say that's happening. But the bottom line is, at the same time, it's also consuming you. Remember, fire doesn't just consume others; it consumes the person who is on fire. So basically, it's turning you into an angry person. So what you want to do is help a person take that energy and turn it into something. Very similar to, similar, not very, but similar to when you teach people how to take grief, the grief over a loss, over a death, over something, trauma, how to take grief and ultimately channel it into growth. I remember my father passed away, just as an example. So I can't say I was angry. I was really, of course, extremely traumatized. Death of a parent is a serious thing, maybe the most definitive thing in my life. My father was a journalist, and he was a publisher of a newspaper. And being the oldest, even though it was a ridiculous, almost insane thing I did, I decided to assume the publisher he was to continue the newspaper. It's called allgemeiner.com. And thank God it's successful, grown, and so on. But I did it only one reason. I couldn't stand the idea that my father spent so many years of his life building this and I should just die with him. I remember telling my siblings, if you wanted to die, let us put it to death. Let's not let it die just because he died, by default. And I remember that year, the year after he passed, and you go through, no one should know death, but if you ever experience, if you know what it's like, it's not pleasant. It really upsets your whole inner core, because it's, you see, death, it's not, especially of a parent, a loving parent. So I remember, but for me it was unbelievable catharsis and healing. And I saw it, my own siblings didn't have quite the way, because I felt like I was literally walking my father's footsteps in doing what I was doing, and it was channeling my deep pain and grief and loss into something very productive. It was a tremendous lesson for me to see, because it wasn't even irrational. It was far more emotional and very visceral. That type of doing something, that all that grief, which is a lot of energy grief, it's very powerful, was channeled into something where I found pride in, and knew I was preserving his legacy, so to speak. And I wasn't doing it for him per se. It was just a positive expression of a negative energy. And I think you could apply the same thing with anger, and I've seen it work. This isn't just a nice theory. It's getting to the bottom of it, that your upsetness, or the root of what's causing you to be angry is very legitimate, but the channel, how you're doing it, the tool, as I said, is not right. It's not a good tool. It's not, as a matter of fact, it's not good for you. You may think it's working, but it's not really the way it should work. And you teach people, take the anger, build something with it. Build a project. Take all that anger and show and demonstrate how much you can accomplish. Isn't that far greater vengeance? And I take my cue from something that was connected to my own people, the Jewish people. They suffered a great Holocaust in World War II, last century, and terrible Holocaust. 6 million, a third of the Jewish people were decimated. No family was unscathed. And I study and I see, what did they do afterwards? They became a state. They have a strong army. No one suggested to go blow up cafes in Berlin or to go to war with Germany, even though, as I said, historically, some people would say that's legitimate. Even if not anything else, to vent, just get even, no one suggested that. Even if no one normal suggested. It was definitely not a. What I see is, when I talk to Holocaust survivors, they tell me, I say, what'd you do with all your anger? They say, my anger, and they open up a photo album, and they show you their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That's my vengeance. That I would not go down and die as they wanted us to die. I rebuilt, and I built a strong, beautiful family. And it's, if I told you this as some type of nice theory, a nice film, a nice movie, a poem, that's a nice fantasy. I'm talking about, I've seen this, I've heard this from people with the grief in every wrinkle of their faces. So it's not like people just tell me a nice romantic thought. And I see this consistently. I'm just using that as an example. Healthy people take the tremendous energy that is the negative energy, and they find some way to channel. They become driven to succeed, a successful business, successful family. Somewhere it's channeled, but it's channeled with an obsession that you will not find by people who have not been hurt. Because more people who have gone through, thank God, more peaceful lives don't have that sense of urgency, don't have that fire. I'm using the fire against them. They don't have the fire. So in a strange way, what we don't want is that when something negative happens to us, which nobody wants, but it teaches you something that you can only gain through that fire. And like you see when people have gone through the fire, any form of fire in life, it has a certain amount of hardening the metal. And now some people get destroyed by it. I'm not suggesting everyone knows how to do it. Some people turn into extremely bitter and angry people, and they're self-destructive and destructive to others. But you look at Viktor Frankl, how he developed logotherapy, if you've read Man's Search of Meaning, and how he documents what he saw in the concentration camps. He says it again and again. He says the people who strived, who their lives were driven by meaning and purpose, higher meaning and purpose, were able to in some way be more resilient and able to handle. Not they suffered less, not that they were not as hurt, not that they didn't lose families, but they somewhere that was a refuge for them that gave them some oasis in this in the sea of pain that they were living. There was a certain element of transcendence. And that is what I want to say ultimately. And this is what goes back to what I said at the beginning of the class, and that is ultimately the greatest thing that dispels darkness is light. You don't fight anger with anger. You don't fight anger, even, some people get angry for getting angry. They get angry themselves for being angry. That's not the way that you're going to resolve it. You don't fight anger with other negative forces. Just like you can't fight darkness with weapons. Light means take the energy that you is upsetting and turning it into something, into an agent and a channel for something that's illuminating. I met, what's her name? It'll come to me in a moment. Anyway, she had level 5 cancer, which, as you know, is the worst, the killer sort, and went through the whole pain of it with the chemo and the loss of hair and the loss of function. I mean, you can imagine, nightmare. But she maintained her sense of humor and lightness, and she came through it. What did she do afterwards, after she came through? She didn't just say, okay, great miracle, let me move on. She established an organization called Comedy Cures. It's online, it's pretty popular, Comedy Cures. And brought it to the country, to the world. That comedy, lightness, and humor is a curing agent. And when you talk to her, you see, that didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of her deep anguish. Now, she could have become a very bitter and angry person at God, at people. Why me? Why not? But no, she channeled it, and in a very interesting way. What was that name of that movie with Robin Williams about humor? Yeah, Patch Adams. Funny movie. Where again he uses comedy. But anyway, so she uses it. So, and I see it. I see the drive, and I see she took all the negative stuff and turned it into something like that. Now, it's not the only one. You see it. You see who was the one that also an actor dealt with Parkinson's. All these names are. Yeah, Michael J. Fox, and others. And there was this Reeves who had that Lou Gehrig's disease. What was it that he had? Not Lou Gehrig's. What did he have? MS? Huh? Yeah. So now God should protect everybody from any obviously such things, but when you see how they turn their liability into assets, you learn tremendous lessons from it. I mean, of course, Helen Keller remains that model person born deaf, blind, mute, and what else? I'm not even sure what else, and how she turned her life around. So good, that's a special soul. Not everybody has that type of willpower and power. But on smaller scale, the bottom line is every energy can be channeled. And the first step is you have to learn to distinguish between yourself and how you're reacting. Because in observing anger, and again, it's not a scientific observation, but I've observed enough of it to tell you, you always see the person who can't control it is because they can't distinguish between themselves and their coping mechanism. They can't distinguish between themselves, and they think this is their only tool. And they don't even think about it. It's thoughtless. Now, of course, the more chronic version I mentioned before, people who just are uncontrollable, or they drink and then they get uncontrollable. That, of course, is more extreme situations, and most cases, they don't just come to their wits on their own until they hit rock bottom, until those around who are enabling and codependent with them do something about it, unfortunately. I've rarely seen somebody who's in that level of extreme rage just one day wakes up, this isn't good. They minimize, etc., etc. So that is already more of an extreme circumstance. But even there, at the end of the day, that person has powerful energy. It's just completely inverted. It's like what they call a black hole. What's a black hole? The gravitational pull of the star is so powerful, it doesn't let any light escape. Psychologically, think of it, it's so much power, but it's going the wrong way. It's going towards absolute destruction. So it's still the same principle that I'm addressing, but there you probably need much more serious intervention. And I'm trying to cover as many bases, as many angles of this. But I wanted to conclude with this, with the ultimate root. Even if you weren't at last week's class, it's a theme I talk about a lot. In the mystics, Isaac Luria, the great mystic, Rabbi Isaac Luria, called Arizal, 16th century. So he revealed, you can say, he taught the doctrine called Tzimtzum, where you really can understand the root of anger as a form of cosmic dissonance. Because at the end of the day, just think about it for a moment. What does anger do usually between two people? It separates them. Love and kindness unites them. And if I get angry at you, or you get angry at me, it's like, I don't want to talk to you, don't come near me. Walls go up. So if you think of it, that in a sense all the roots of all the vices we'll talk about have certain similarities. If you're able to go down the rabbit hole all the way to the core root of any of them, they're going to come down to some form of dissonance. Like I mentioned before, a new healthy born child is not going to be angry. What's there to be angry about? You don't get something, and if it's kind people, you'll find a way to get what you need. Anger is a form of dissonance, of disconnect. Back to what I said earlier about people who hurt each other, even though we may be part of each other. So anger is a distorted and what's the word I want to say, unhealthy form of dissonance between you and yourself, you and others, and you and the world, in a way. Because you'll see many people get angry, they also get angry at themselves. How often do you beat yourself up and say, why did I do that? Why did I do that? I mean, obsess to the extent of I shouldn't have done it that way. I should have done it a different way. So it's not so disassociated. I can't say that every anger to others is usually angry at yourself, but probably in many cases there is an anger to yourself. You're just blaming it on someone else. Because people who are really comfortable with themselves and you don't get angry at yourself, you're most likely not going to get so angry at others. And you'll find a way to somewhat deal with it. So in the root of the root, if you can put it that way, the cosmic order is called the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is a utter concealment. Talk about a black hole. An utter concealment that has created a duality in this universe. Now, if you're familiar with modern physics, quantum mechanics, and also with called psychological quantum theory, I don't know if anyone coined that word, but the idea, there's a certain underlying unity that every human being has. Why children don't get angry, just like children don't lie? Because they don't have duplicity in their lives. They don't have duality in their lives. What you see is what you get. You see a certain seamlessness. It's as we grow into adults where we become self-conscious. What does self-conscious mean? I'm conscious of myself. You're aware of yourself. You're aware of your sexuality, of yourself. Like the Bible puts it, they were aware of their nakedness, so they were ashamed. A newborn child is not ashamed of its nudity because what's wrong with it? It's part of their sacred being. It's only when we become conscious of ourselves where the duality is created. There's me, there's you. There's me, there's my feelings. I'm upset at myself. Where we begin to have this type of almost, I don't say split personality, but a type of fragmentation within our own psyches, and a fragmentation with others, whether it's parents, siblings, friends, strangers, and a fragmentation with the larger world, what they call existential loneliness, a sense of an existential disconnect, where you feel like at the end of the day I'm all alone. I may have friends, I may have some love in my life, but I walk home alone. No one can really know what's going on. When I'm in my most deepest pain, no one can enter there. And we all know pain is associated with that type of loneliness. You feel no one can get me, and therefore nobody wants to be with me in a place like that. Who wants to be with someone that's in such misery? All this is connected to the dissonance that relates to anger. It may not be anger per se, like I described before, the fire of anger, but it's the disconnect that happens. The disconnect between two people, the disconnect between you and yourself. So if you really think of it, it's ultimately the remedy, the repair of a person's anger is really a repair of the schism and the splits in our personalities and coming to peace with that. Like many people do carry a lot of anger. How did I allow that to happen? And they never ever forgive themselves. And they're never ever able to really come to terms. They may ignore it, go into denial, forget it. But that becomes another force of split. So I wanted to just add that into the bigger equation, because when you get down to it, that's what anger does. And think about it. What does fire do? When fire burns, it separates things. It doesn't join things. You take a piece of paper, you take a piece of wood. What does fire do? It breaks it down to the elements. It has benefits that come out of it, but fire is a divisive force. It breaks things apart. Water, as we shall talk about in later weeks, brings things together. Water does not break things apart. Water dissolves things. Water will cause things to get concentrated. Fire separates. Fire separates. And because anger separates, and because at the end of the day it's a separation between ourselves and our souls, it's a separation between who you are and what you do, which, by the way, is the root of a lot of people's anger. They don't like what they do. They don't like their jobs. They don't like the place they got stuck in. And they don't feel that it's really me. I'm not really expressing myself. I mean, interestingly, though I'm not a Marxist, but Karl Marx, not Groucho, Karl Marx talks a lot about alienation. in his critique of capitalism, the alienation that exists between the worker and his product, the worker and other workers, the worker and the boss, the worker and the government. And we see this. Churchill did say that democracy or capitalism is the worst system, but that he never found a better one. And socialism or Marxism never really became viable for all the obvious reasons. But theoretically, he has a very good point. There is an alienation. When you're working in the field in an agrarian society, so then people plowed their fields, the potatoes they worked on and toiled became their dinner. You're in touch, a certain holistic, a certain organic connection. Once industrialization came into the picture, you no longer benefit directly from your labor. You press buttons, someone else makes money, and someone else is benefiting from it. And then the alienation goes with each other. The competition, so even there, I would say, the anger is, the roots of the reasons for being angry are legitimate. Whether they should be translated into a bloodbath of guillotines and so on, that's another story. That again it's channeling it the wrong way. Now maybe there was no alternative. They had to overthrow the governments. It was the only way was to be violent. It's another discussion. I'm not getting into second guessing what the revolutionaries in those days and age. At the end of the day, the communists were also doing the same thing to the czars. So revolutions are not necessarily always healthy. They may come from the correct motivation in the sense of, the bourgeois and the proletariat and that whole separation of classes. But my point I want to really make is that it's connected to the separation. So it's rooted back into the Lurianic doctrine of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is that Hebrew word called concentration or concealment or contraction. Very much a fire-like type of force that creates division and ultimately duplicity and duality, I should say, and then duplicity. And that is also a very big component of anger. So, on a happy note, let's conclude on what's the opposite of a happy note. Happy note is this. Everything you see, everything you experience has a lesson to us. If you see anger in your own life or in other people's lives, it's not something just to dismiss like there's nothing going on. You have to realize, as I said, separate the fruit from the peel. The tool can be very inappropriate. But if a certain person is angry, you have to figure out why. Again, I'm of course barring the situation where the anger has no real basis or it's for petty reasons. And that's how you help another person. You try to get to the bottom why they're angry. And then find ways to harness and channel that to the right direction. A unifying way instead of a separating way. So, I hope I covered to some extent this first part. I'm sure I'll get some questions and we'll address it further. But this has been part one, what we're calling the new series called Vice Advice. Vice Advice. You got it? And with the focus on the positive. But as I said, the time to time, we do have to sometimes get into the nitty-gritty, into the mud, and talk about some of the vices. Now, you all look to me very pleasant and very non-angry people. So that's good to hear. It's good to feel. That's the vibe I get. I may be wrong. But online, the thing is, I don't know how there, because there I can't see anybody. And we don't really get the vibes in cyberspace quite the same way. You agree? So it was an honor to share a few words. Nice to meet you. And nice to meet you too. You're also here for the first time. So may we all have a very pleasant, joyful, and uplifting week. Now remember, this topic is also relevant from a Jewish point of view. We're entering this month of Adar, the Hebrew month, which is all about joy. So it's not incidental. And next week we're going to cover vanity, vice number 2. I'm going to try to slay the vices. I think I'm doing 8 parts. Even though I know there's 7 vices, I'm going to do 8 parts, and I'll also share some of the sources next week when the source, I'll share it right now. It's based a lot on the writings of Rabbi Chaim Vital, the student of the Arizal, in a book that's called Sha'arei Kedusha, The Gates of Holiness, and cited somewhat in Tanya chapter 1. But I'll elaborate more as we go along, just to give you some sources. And please stay in touch. Anyone, everyone. And you leave me your email address so we can be in touch that way. If anybody has questions or any way I could help, Meaningful Life Center could help you in your journey, it's my honor and pleasure to do so. And let's all join together to create a less angry world, a more happy world. How's that? Thank you very much. Okay. Keith. Okay.
It's better live. It was better live.
I'm sure.